Hello everyone, welcome to the Green Man channel. Hope you're all good and well. So it's been a little while since I did my last one of these kind of countdown lists. Last time doing my top 20 albums of 2018, of course, and this time I'm doing my top 20 albums of 2017. A year for me personally, which was really quite tough actually. I'm not going to bore you with details, but it was certainly the music that helped me get through that year. And some of these albums in this top 20 list I now, regard actually as some of my favourites of all time. And you might say, is 5 years really long enough to make that call? Well, honestly, I think possibly it is because, I made really special connections to a lot of these albums that year. And, a few of them later on as well that I discovered post 2017 that I absolutely just have come to form that special connection with them. Just a couple of other things to say before I crack on with the top 20 list. There are no honourable mentions this time, and that's basically because I didn't really have any honourable mentions with the original list I had, and I couldn't scrabble together a few honourable mentions before I wanted to put up this video. Also, there aren't as many CDs here. I mean, I guess I quite wanted to stock up, for doing this, but I am keeping an eye on my bank account at the moment and making sure I'm kind of not spending more than I can currently afford. But with that all out of the way, I'm looking forward to sharing this list with you all, and expect the usual kind of interesting mix of genres and subgenres as always with some of my top 20 lists. So let's crack on with things. Let's stop the waffle and start the countdown with number 20 with Airiel's Molten Young Lovers. Airiel are a shoegaze band. Perhaps, I don't know if they're maybe best known for their EP Winks and Kisses, because that's got some really great shoegaze songs on that album, and this was their second kind of full-length album. I think Sealand was their other one from the 2000s, and this album was a really great return, I thought, for Airiel, and doing what they do best and really putting out some really memorable songs on here with some fantastic pretty up-tempo kind of shoegaze rhythms on here that I really enjoy as well, on tracks like Cloud Bursting in particular. It's a great way to start this album off. Also really like the title track, Molten Young Lovers, as well. It's kind of slightly more romantic style track, but really, really well structured track as well from Airiel, and a really good album from that year. At number 19, we have Dvne making their second appearance on one of my top 20 lists with their debut album Asheran. Really enjoyed this album. This is kind of progressive stoner sludgy album. But what Dvne do particularly well, I think, as I think I said last time in my top 20 albums of 2021 list, is their layering and the way they build their proggy tracks up, and build them to those really big climaxes that are fantastic and crushing. In tracks like Thirst, I think it is on here, and Descent of the Asheran are just pretty mind-blowing tracks, and what a way to start their careers off, I guess. This band, I think it was their debut album, with a great way to start. At number 18, we move on to Mastodon with Emperor of Sand. And to be honest, not one of my favourite Mastodon albums, but in spite of that, still a good Mastodon album. And just a few really great tracks on here. I mean, I think my favourites on here would be Roots Remain. Jaguar God gets mentioned a lot, and I do really love that track as well. Andromeda, with a really cool kind of pretty sick guitar riff from Bill. I think this album from Mastodon is still probably one I would regard in my top 20 of 2017, even if it's not one of my all-time favourite Mastodon albums. Next up at 17, we have Code Orange's Forever, which kind of felt like their kind of breakout album. I certainly wasn't aware of Code Orange prior to this album release, and I think Forever was, really, really interesting listen, with like a really kind of, there's a jagged style to this album with its stop-starty nature. But it works as a whole incredibly well in spite of that approach to this album, and some really cool little industrial style nuances that they use in effects as well, which I love. I think Code Orange is Forever is a really good album from 2017, and it comes in at number 17. Number 16, I move on to another shoegaze album, the second shoegaze album on this list, which was Deafcult Auras. An album I recently listened to quite a bit on my train journey going up to Edinburgh, and it was music really suited the kind of journey and feel of that trip, or the kind of landscapes I was watching out the window go past. And it's just a kind of, yeah, it's got that lovely warm sound that you get with a lot of shoegaze, but the vocal harmonies on this album are fantastic, I think, as well. A really soothing and yeah, pretty memorable shoegaze album from 2017 from Deafcult. At number 15 we have Steven Wilson's To the Bone. And even though this was the follow-up to Hand Cannot Erase, and it was always going to be extremely difficult to follow up on an album like Hand Cannot Erase, I did like To the Bone a lot. And even though he was kind of veering towards more kind of pop sensibilities on this album, I thought it was still a really great effort. And, you know, I really enjoyed tracks with the sort of power pop element like Pariah. And, you know, Refuge was another great, pretty moving track on this album. Generally a pretty moving album altogether, despite its leaning towards some of this slightly more upbeat pop style that it also adopted. Number 14 is Soen's Lykaia. Okay, probably one of my favourite prog metal albums from that year, I think. And, you know, for fans of Opeth, I think you probably really like Soen. They're a really strong vocalist who just does clean vocals on this album. It's really good though, and an album which I found myself listening to quite a bit that year. It comes in at number 14. At number 13, we have an album I suspect many of you sub to my channel will recognise, Kreator's Gods of Violence, a great thrash album from 2017 with, you know, great riffs, great solos. It feels like, considering how long Kreator have been around, it's amazing they're still putting out, you know, albums of this kind of quality and caliber. I think Gods of Violence is a great album. Really like the title track. Love Satan is Real. I think it's Lying with Eagle Wings is another one I really liked to listen to a lot that year. So Kreator, Gods of Violence comes in number 13. And now we move on to another pretty well-known name, certainly from recent times in the tech death part of the metal community, perhaps more than any other. That's Archspire with their album Relentless Mutation. And you know, this was pretty breakthrough, pretty unusual. Those kind of rapid fire vocals that almost sound as technical as the instrumentation in Archspire were quite something and quite unique to me at that point in time. And they just absolutely tear it up with this album, as they did with their recent album To Bleed the Future. Relentless Mutation is relentless, and it's not an album that in any way overstays its welcome. It's just an album that does what it needs to and slams the door behind it. Next up, we have Power Trip with Nightmare Logic, and this is at number 11. And, you know, sadly, Riley Gale, the frontman, is no longer with us, but I think he really left his mark with this album, at least with Nightmare Logic. The second album certainly harks back to an era of that style of thrash metal. You know, I like all the kind of reverb that they use on this album, that drum sound as well. It's just really kind of old school sounding, yet it obviously is in pretty modern production value as well, and it just sounds great. It's just a really good album with a lot of good groove. You know, I like my thrash to have some of those really good, hefty, groovy riffs in, and Nightmare Logic does not disappoint on that front. It is a really good album from 2017. So we move on to the top 10, and unfortunately, another band whose frontman we have very recently lost. In fact, only last week now, and that is Black Dahlia Murder with Nightbringers. And you know, for a band like this, just keep putting out album after album of good quality, you know, good quality death metal from a slightly more melodic style, I guess, but to keep putting them out album after album, just great stuff. And this has one of my all-time favorite opening tracks, I think, from any metal album I've ever heard, Widowmaker. What a way to start off this album, and it doesn't disappoint for the rest of it. I would say, for the most part, you've got great songs like Matriarch, Jars, Kings of the Night World, and it's just so sad that that Trevor is no longer with us. Next up at number 9, we have Eldamar's A Dark Forgotten Past, and this album became the soundtrack for me that year that I listened to quite a bit when I was reading fantasy books, and I was reading my way through the Wheel of Time Wheel of Time series of books. And this Eldamar album was just a great soundtrack for all that reading. You know, it really filled the imagination. And it kind of, as you're listening to it, it does sound like it's come from an elvish forest or something. You know, the way it sounds is, you know, at times really kind of beguiling, really beautiful. And I just think, you know, this one-man project is one of the atmospheric kind of black metal albums or artists I've really come to love over kind of recent years. Eldamar. Eldamar's A Dark Forgotten Past. Can't recommend that one enough for you. At number 8, we have an album which kind of became iconic in that year, perhaps as much for the album artwork as well as for the album. That is Bellwitch's Mirror Reaper, the Funeral Doom group pairing with an absolutely iconic album, and a one-track kind of masterpiece. But you can't just listen to it for 15 minutes, take a break, come back. You have to listen to the long crawl all the way through. Spare an hour and a half, because it's almost that long, isn't it? And just spare it, just absorb it, experience it with the album artwork in front of you, and just enjoy the Bellwitch full experience of Mirror Reaper. Comes in here at number 8. At number 7, we have Elder's Reflections of a Floating World. What I thought was, an album which appeared on many, many lists that year as well. I have to say, I saw it on a lot of lists prior to the days of me doing my channel, obviously. And I just think it's got some great arrangements on here. And I really like how Elder are able to, keep and retain the really heavy guitar sound that they have, the really stoner style riffs, and yet pull off those melodies within that as well. And I think that's quite an amazing achievement that Elder have managed to pull off with their style and sound, with some absolutely stunning lead guitar moments in this album, Reflection of the Floating World, as well. And I think a bit of a classic from that year, rather like with the Bellwitch album, Elder, Reflections of the Floating World, comes in at number 7. My number 6 is a comeback album, really, after some 22 years since their previous album. We're moving on to shoegaze once again, and a band which regarded somewhat as the pioneers of the entire kind of shoegaze early 90s, when it was kind of seen as being born, if you like. And this was some return album by this band. You may know them for albums like Sivlaki, Just for a Day, Pygmalion. And we have here their self-titled from 2017, Slowdive with Slowdive. And that album cover as well is perfect for the music. I think just somehow they've just found the perfect album cover there. And it is just, you only need to hear the first few echoey chords of slow-mo, and I think you're sorted. It's just an amazing journey, amazing sonic experience. And yeah, one of those kind of special albums I now regard this as pretty special. Looking back at this one, and just how perfect it just felt for the time that I listened to this for the first time. At number 5, we have The Contortionist with Clairvoyant. Another album which kind of packs, and this one packs a really quite powerful emotional punch. And I think, given the themes and given the backstory I've heard about this album as well, and I think it was a friend of the band or a friend of the singer that passed away, so it's kind of in dedication to him, I think. And it's absolutely amazing. Another great sonic experience, beautiful production. And honestly, the closing track on this album is one of the best I've ever heard, perhaps the best ever prog metal. I mean, that is going some way to say that, but I remember hearing it and just being completely floored by that closing track when I first heard it, which is, of course, Monochrome Pensive by The Contortionist. That's Contortionist Clairvoyant in at number 5. At number 4, another great album from this band, Pallbearer with Heartless. Another album which made it onto a lot of lists, I think, as I recall, but I thought totally justified. Another album which so beautifully combines melody with sort of heavier, that heavier, slow, crushing sound that they have with those big chords. And there's a lot to like on this album. There's also some slightly more up-tempo moments with I Saw the End and Cruel Road as well. So it's not all one-way traffic. It's not all super slow like the debut album or anything like that. So if you want something with a little bit that tiny bit of variation on here as well. For me, another, I'd maybe say another masterpiece and follow up to what I consider a masterpiece as well, Foundation is a Burden, from a couple of years prior to this one. Next up, an album I've talked about in my Enslaved ranking video, E, which I did rank as my number one. So you might think, why isn't this your number one for 2017? And it's only because there are two albums that are absolutely, I really, the next two albums on this list, I really do regard as, just fantastic albums. So it's the only reason this isn't number one. But I do adore this album. And so I remember hearing Storm Sun and being blown away completely, watching that video, listening to it, and just brilliant all the way through. Really great concepts and ideas that they've tied in with the music, as Enslaved often do. Axis of the Worlds and Feathers of Eel, I think, were brilliant too on this one. Another great album from 2017. We move on to number two, and I've spoken about this album on the channel before, so if you're a long time, you haven't been around on the channel for a while, you probably know this is even, maybe predict this is coming, but it will be a big shock if you're not aware of what I'm about to choose here, because it is one of my more left field picks on this whole list, but it's Alvvays with Antisocialites. Just about half an hour long, very, very, pretty short album, almost EP length. But one of the best albums, I think, from the last maybe 10 years or so that I've heard. It's kind of indie pop, but I don't want to simplify it to just that. It's the songwriting on here is fantastic. Everything is, the song structures are very good. It's a very, very catchy album, but not in a way I think that's annoying. It's sort of catchy in the best way possible. It harks back to a time that kind of reminds me actually a little bit of Blondie in their sort of Eat to the Beat era a little bit. If you're partial to some of that stuff, maybe you're not, but I just personally just adore this album. And I remember listening to the opening track. I think it was actually during the lockdown side until I actually discovered this one as well. So it's actually, it helped me through that time. But Alvvays Antisocialites number two. Just is that way. I just love that album that much. I cannot deny it at all. It's just that good an album. Number one, my number one pick was truly the album. I think if there were any album I could say that I love the most from 2017, it's probably this one. If there were any album I could say that got me through that year the most out of all the other albums on this list, it's this one. And it is Threshold, Legends of the Shires. The return of Glyn Morgan to the band, which I guess, he hadn't been in the band for quite some time, since the 90s, I think. But he gave this album a bit of a rougher edge with his singing, I think, that Threshold hadn't had for a while. I mean, they'd had Damien, of course, and I loved their stuff with him too, but it was like this, Glyn coming back gave this album just a new lease of life. And every track he's on fire, and every track itself, the instrumentation, the usual kind of crunchy guitar riffs, fabulous kind of big kind of 80s sounding, massive guitar solos with those great kind of peaks and that they use on this album as well. Just great stuff. And that is my number one pick from 2017. And that finishes off my list for 2017. So do drop in a comment your favourite albums from this year. And if you're new to the channel, feel free to drop a like and subscribe, all that business. Otherwise, until my next video, take care, everybody. Bye for now.